The greatest test of a society is not how it treats the powerful, but how it treats the people it believes no longer matter. The automatic doors slid open with a quiet hiss as the elderly man stepped into St. Andrew Medical Center, bringing with him the faint chill of a gray November morning. No one looked up. Phones continued ringing behind the reception desk. Stretchers rolled across polished floors. Nurses hurried past with clipboards pressed against their chests. Somewhere down the hallway, an overhead speaker calmly called another physician to another room. The hospital moved with the rhythm of urgency, and the old man seemed invisible inside it. Walter Hayes paused just inside the entrance, removing a faded Navy cap embroidered with the words U.S. Army veteran. His silver hair was neatly combed despite the steady drizzle outside. His brown jacket had been carefully repaired at both elbows, and his worn leather shoes carried the quiet shine of someone who still polished them every Sunday, even if no one noticed anymore. He cleared his throat softly before making the slow walk toward the reception counter, one careful step after another. "Good morning," he said with a polite smile that reached tired blue eyes. "I have an appointment. I've been feeling a little weak since yesterday." The receptionist barely glanced at him before returning to her computer screen. "Insurance card and ID." Walter nodded immediately, already reaching into an old wallet whose edges had softened after decades of use. His hands trembled just enough to make pulling out the cards take longer than expected. A line began forming behind him. Someone sighed impatiently. Another person checked a watch. Without saying a word, the receptionist tapped her keyboard, printed a clipboard, and slid it across the counter. "Fill these out. Have a seat. Someone will call your name." Walter thanked her as though she had done him a great kindness. He carried the clipboard to a nearby chair beneath a television playing muted morning news. Every seat around him slowly filled with people scrolling through phones, talking quietly with family members, or sipping coffee from paper cups. Walter had neither a phone nor anyone beside him. He adjusted his glasses and began writing carefully, each letter deliberate, his handwriting still remarkably neat after all these years. 20 minutes passed, then 40, an hour. His name was never called. Several patients who had arrived well after him disappeared behind the secured doors one after another. Walter never complained. Every few minutes, he simply looked toward the hallway with quiet hope before lowering his eyes again. He folded his hands over the clipboard, breathing a little slower than before. A volunteer pushing a wheelchair smiled kindly as she passed, but she assumed he was waiting for someone else. Even the security officer stationed near the entrance only noticed an elderly man sitting alone. No one noticed the small bronze service pin fastened beneath the lapel of his jacket. No one noticed the carefully folded photograph tucked halfway inside his wallet. No one noticed the years carried silently behind those gentle eyes. To everyone rushing through the hospital that morning, Walter Hayes was simply another old man waiting his turn. And somewhere several floors above, completely unaware that fate had already entered his building, Chief Surgeon Dr. Ethan Carter stepped out of the elevator to begin what everyone believed would be just another ordinary day. The digital clock mounted above the waiting room quietly changed from 9:23 to 10:11. Walter Hayes noticed it only because the second hand seemed louder than the conversations around him. Time had always mattered to him. During his years in uniform, arriving 1 minute late could mean the difference between success and failure. Even now, long after retirement, he still arrived everywhere at least 15 minutes early. That habit had never left him. He shifted slightly in the plastic chair, pressing one hand against his side as another wave of discomfort passed through him. It faded after a few steady breaths. He smiled anyway when a young mother walked past with a little boy clutching a stuffed dinosaur. The child looked back and waved. Walter tipped the brim of his faded veteran cap with a gentle smile, making the boy grin before disappearing around the corner. Small moments like that still made the world feel kind. His clipboard rested neatly on his lap. Every line had been completed in careful block letters. Emergency contact remained blank. He stared at that empty space for a moment before quietly placing the pen back into its holder. There simply was no one left to write. His wife, Margaret, had passed away almost 12 years earlier after a long illness. They had never been blessed with children, though neither of them had ever considered their life incomplete. They had built something quieter than most people dreamed about. 47 years of shared breakfasts, evening walks, Sunday church services, Christmas mornings with neighbors instead of grandchildren. Walter had once told Margaret that an ordinary life spent beside the right person was the greatest adventure anyone could ask for. After she was gone, the little house felt larger every year. Yet he refused to let loneliness become bitterness. Every Tuesday morning, he volunteered at the local community center, helping young veterans fill out paperwork they found confusing. Every Thursday, he repaired broken bicycles for neighborhood children without accepting a single dollar. On Veterans Day, he stood silently at the memorial with the same polished shoes and neatly pressed jacket, never expecting anyone to recognize his face. Recognition had never been the reason he served. Across the waiting room, another receptionist changed shifts. The new employee glanced briefly at Walter's chart sitting beneath several others before carrying the stack toward another desk. Someone asked a question. Someone answered with a shrug. The clipboard disappeared beneath fresh paperwork. Walter did not notice. He simply folded his hands and watched the rain streak softly down the tall hospital windows. Outside, people hurried beneath umbrellas while ambulance lights reflected across wet pavement like scattered ribbons of red and blue. Inside, warm air carried the familiar scent of fresh coffee and antiseptic. A television anchor smiled silently from the muted screen, while closed captions crawled across the bottom with headlines that seemed to belong to another world entirely. Walter reached into his weathered wallet, searching for a peppermint candy Margaret used to insist he always carried. Instead, his fingers brushed against an old photograph. He paused, studying the edges that had softened after decades of careful handling. His thumb rested gently against the smiling faces captured in another lifetime before he quietly slipped the picture back into its place. He never noticed that one corner of the photograph remained slightly exposed, waiting for the eyes of someone who had spent an entire lifetime unknowingly searching for it. On the 7th floor, the rhythm of the hospital changed the moment Dr. Ethan Carter stepped into the surgical wing. Conversations became quieter. Nurses straightened their posture without thinking. Residents carrying tablets instinctively moved aside to clear the hallway. It was never because he demanded attention. It was because he had earned it over 25 years of calm decisions, impossible surgeries, and a reputation built not on confidence alone, but on consistency. Ethan acknowledged everyone with the same brief nod before walking toward the morning conference room. His white coat remained perfectly pressed despite the long hours he usually worked, and the silver name badge over his pocket reflected the bright ceiling lights with every measured step. Inside the conference room, a dozen physicians waited around a large table covered with patient files and digital scans. The discussion began exactly on schedule. Ethan listened more than he spoke. When younger doctors presented treatment plans, he never interrupted. He simply asked questions that forced them to think one step further. His voice never became louder than necessary. Somehow, that made everyone listen even more carefully. Medicine is not only about solving problems, he often reminded new residents. It is about remembering there is a person attached to every chart. The words had become almost legendary inside the hospital, repeated by nurses and interns long after he left the room. Few people knew where that philosophy had come from. Fewer still knew that Ethan carried the memory of one story from his childhood into every operating room he entered. As a boy, he had often sat beside his father on quiet Sunday afternoons, listening to stories that were never really about war. His father rarely spoke about battles or medals. Instead, he spoke about ordinary acts of courage. A soldier who shared his last meal. Another who carried injured friends for miles without expecting recognition. There was one name his father mentioned more often than any other. Walter Hayes. Ethan had never met the man. He only remembered the expression on his father's face whenever that name was spoken. It was never admiration alone. It was gratitude. "If I am here," his father once told him while placing an old photograph back into a wooden box, "it is because one good man chose compassion over fear." Never forget that every stranger has a story you cannot see. Ethan had been only 12 years old, but those words settled somewhere deep inside him. Years later, after his father passed away, the wooden box remained in Ethan's study. He had opened it only a handful of times, each visit bringing back the faded photograph of several young soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder beneath an American flag, smiling as though the future belonged to all of them. The hospital meeting ended with routine updates. Surgeons gathered their folders and prepared for another demanding day. Ethan checked the schedule on his tablet. 3 operations, 2 consultations, 1 lecture for medical students. It looked like every other Tuesday. He slipped the tablet beneath his arm and walked toward the elevator, unaware that only a few floors below, the man whose name had quietly shaped his entire understanding of honor was still sitting alone in a plastic chair, waiting with the same patient dignity that had guided him his entire life. Nearly 2 hours had passed since Walter Hayes first walked through the hospital doors. The waiting room had emptied and filled again more than once. Morning appointments flowed into lunchtime consultations as though the hours belonged to everyone except him. He slowly stood, careful not to lose his balance, and walked back toward the reception desk with the same quiet courtesy he had carried all his life. "Excuse me," he said gently. "I was wondering if perhaps my name was accidentally missed." The receptionist looked at her screen for only a moment before answering without meeting his eyes. "If your name has not been called, then you are still waiting." Walter offered a small nod. "I understand. I only wanted to make sure I did not misunderstand anything." She pointed toward the seating area with practiced efficiency. "Someone will get you when it is your turn." Walter thanked her once again, although there had been little kindness in the exchange. He returned to his chair without another word. A young medical assistant carrying several patient folders glanced toward him for a brief second before following another nurse through the secured doors. "Has he been here all morning?" she whispered. "Apparently," the nurse replied. "Probably another walk-in without anything serious." Their voices disappeared down the hallway before Walter could hear them. A few chairs away, an elderly woman noticed him rubbing one hand against the other to stay warm beneath the steady flow of air conditioning. Without saying anything, she offered him a folded blanket from her lap. Walter smiled warmly, but shook his head. "Thank you, ma'am. Please keep it. You may need it more than I do." She insisted. He accepted only after she smiled back. "My wife always told me not to argue with kind ladies," he said softly, earning the first genuine laugh anyone had shared with him that morning. The moment was small. It lasted only seconds. Yet it reminded him that compassion rarely announced itself loudly. It usually arrived in quiet gestures no one else noticed. Across the room, a first-year resident named Emily Brooks stepped out of an examination room while reviewing notes on her tablet. She paused when she saw Walter still sitting alone. "Was he not already waiting when I came in?" she asked another employee. "Yes," came the casual reply. "Registration is probably sorting something out. Do not worry about it. We are already behind schedule." Emily looked back once more. Something about the old man's calm expression unsettled her. Most people waiting that long became frustrated. Some demanded answers. Others complained loudly. Walter simply sat with perfect posture, occasionally smiling at strangers who happened to glance his way. Emily considered walking over to him, but another physician called her name from down the corridor. Duty pulled her in one direction. Instinct pulled her in another. She hesitated only a second before following the senior doctor. Walter remained alone beneath the muted television. His wallet rested beside him on the empty chair, the worn leather slightly open after he searched for another peppermint candy. The corner of the old photograph remained visible, unnoticed by everyone who hurried past. Somewhere above, an elevator door opened with a quiet chime. Dr. Ethan Carter stepped inside after finishing his morning conference, intending only to visit another department before his first surgery. Neither man knew their paths were now separated by only a few floors, and only a matter of minutes. The elevator doors opened onto the main lobby with a soft chime, and Dr. Ethan Carter stepped into the steady current of patients, nurses, volunteers, and visitors moving through the hospital. He was reviewing the schedule on his tablet while walking, but years of experience had taught him to notice the smallest details around him. A frightened child holding a nurse's hand. An exhausted husband sleeping upright beside his wife's room. A volunteer quietly comforting someone who had received difficult news. Hospitals revealed the best and worst moments of ordinary lives every single day. Ethan believed that was exactly why every person deserved to be seen. As he crossed the waiting area, his eyes drifted almost absent-mindedly toward the rows of chairs. Most people looked anxious or distracted. One elderly man looked different. Walter Hayes sat with perfect posture despite obvious fatigue. His hands rested calmly over a folded blanket, and his worn wallet remained beside him on the empty chair. The corner of an old photograph peeked from the weathered leather. Ethan slowed his pace without realizing it. There was something strangely familiar about the picture, although he was still too far away to understand why. Before he could take another step, a charge nurse intercepted him with an urgent question about an afternoon procedure. Ethan answered thoughtfully, reviewed a laboratory report on the tablet she carried, and suggested a slight adjustment to the treatment plan. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. Yet when he looked back toward the waiting area, the elderly man had lowered his head, quietly rubbing one hand against his chest before taking another slow breath. Ethan frowned slightly, not from alarm, but from instinct. He began walking toward the seating area. At that same moment, the receptionist noticed the chief surgeon approaching and quickly stood a little straighter. "Good morning, Dr. Carter," she said politely. Ethan returned the greeting with a brief smile before glancing toward Walter. "Has that gentleman already been evaluated?" he asked casually. The receptionist looked at her computer. "I believe he is still waiting." Ethan looked at the clock mounted above the desk. "How long?" She hesitated before scrolling through the registration record. "Just over 2 hours, doctor." Ethan's expression remained calm, but something changed in his eyes. 2 hours, he repeated quietly. "Yes, sir. The department has been extremely busy this morning." Ethan nodded once. He understood busy mornings better than anyone. Yet his attention had already shifted back to Walter, who was now carefully reaching for the wallet resting beside him. As Walter lifted it, the old photograph slipped free and drifted gently onto the polished floor. Neither Walter nor anyone else noticed. Ethan did. He bent down without hesitation and picked it up before it could slide beneath another chair. For a brief second, his eyes settled on the faded image. Several young soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder beneath an American flag, smiling into a camera that had captured a summer afternoon decades earlier. One face struck him immediately, not because he had ever met the man, but because he had seen that same photograph inside his father's wooden keepsake box throughout his childhood. His heartbeat slowed. His fingers tightened ever so slightly around the worn edges of the picture. Then his eyes moved from the photograph to the elderly man sitting quietly only a few feet away. Walter Hayes looked up as a pair of polished brown shoes stopped beside his chair. He immediately noticed the photograph in the man's hand and offered an apologetic smile. "I am sorry," he said softly. "My wallet has become almost as old as I am. It does not hold on to things the way it used to." Dr. Ethan Carter knelt without hesitation, holding the faded picture with both hands as though it were something precious. "I believe this belongs to you, sir." Walter accepted it carefully, brushing one thumb across the worn surface before slipping it back into his wallet. "Thank you. I have carried that picture for more than 50 years. Ethan remained still for another moment, unable to take his eyes off the old man's face. The wrinkles were deeper now. His hair had turned completely white. Time had changed almost everything. Yet there was something unmistakably familiar in his calm expression. Ethan spoke quietly. "May I ask you something?" Walter nodded. "Of course." Ethan pointed gently toward the photograph. "Were you in the 101st Airborne Division?" Walter's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Yes, I was." "And was there a man named Daniel Carter in your unit?" For the first time that morning, Walter's expression changed completely. His tired blue eyes widened with surprise before softening into quiet recognition. "Daniel Carter," he repeated almost in a whisper. "Now that is a name I have not heard in many years." Ethan felt his heartbeat quicken. "He was my father." Silence settled between them. Not an uncomfortable silence, but one filled with decades neither man could quite describe. Walter studied Ethan's face more carefully. Then a gentle smile appeared. "You have his eyes," he said. "I should have noticed sooner." Ethan swallowed hard. Memories rushed back with unexpected clarity. His father sitting beside the fireplace on cold winter evenings. The old wooden keepsake box. The faded photograph. The stories that always ended with the same sentence. "One good man gave me another chance at life." Ethan had imagined Walter Hayes countless times throughout his childhood. In his mind, he had always remained young, standing proudly in military uniform beneath a bright summer sky. He had never imagined finding him sitting alone in a hospital waiting room, quietly overlooked by everyone around him. "My father spoke about you often," Ethan said, his voice lower than before. "He said there was not a year that passed without thanking God for you." Walter looked down with gentle embarrassment. "Your father gave me far too much credit." We all looked after one another back then. He never believed that, Ethan answered. He always said you chose to stay when others told you to leave. He said that decision allowed him to come home, marry my mother, and raise our family. Walter smiled faintly. Daniel became a wonderful husband. He showed me pictures of your mother every chance he had. Ethan felt warmth rise behind his eyes. For a brief moment, the busy hospital disappeared. The voices, the ringing phones, the footsteps echoing across polished floors. None of them mattered anymore. Only then did Ethan glance toward the registration desk and notice Walter's intake bracelet still untouched. He looked at the computer screen behind the receptionist, then back at Walter. Sir, he asked gently, how long have you been waiting? Walter answered with the same quiet grace he had shown everyone else that morning. Oh, I suppose it has been a little while. Everyone here seems very busy. I did not want to be any trouble. For a long moment, Dr. Ethan Carter said nothing. He simply looked at Walter Hayes, then toward the reception desk where the registration record remained untouched after more than 2 hours. Around them, the hospital continued moving with practiced efficiency. Telephones rang. Elevators opened and closed. Wheelchairs rolled across polished floors. Yet to Ethan, the noise seemed to fade into the background. His father had once told him that character revealed itself most clearly when no one important was watching. Standing there, he realized an entire hospital had been watching the wrong things. Ethan slowly stood. His expression remained calm, but there was a quiet certainty in every movement. He walked directly to the reception counter. The staff immediately noticed the change in his demeanor. Please pull up Mr. Walter Hayes' chart, he said. The receptionist hurried to comply. Doctor, we were just about to. Ethan gently raised one hand. He did not interrupt with anger. He interrupted with silence. The room became noticeably quieter. How long has Mr. Hayes been registered? He asked. The receptionist swallowed before reading the screen. 2 hours and 19 minutes. Ethan nodded once. Was his triage completed? No, doctor. Was a physician notified? No, doctor. Was anyone assigned to reassess him while he waited? The answer came almost as a whisper. No. Ethan lowered his eyes for a brief moment before looking back at the staff. There was no accusation in his face. Only disappointment. This is not about blame, he said quietly. This is about responsibility. Every conversation nearby seemed to stop. Even visitors waiting across the lobby turned toward the desk, sensing that something unusual was happening. Ethan pressed a button on the nearest hospital phone. This is Dr. Carter. Please prepare an examination room immediately. I also need the charge nurse, a complete assessment team, and internal medicine available now. The operator answered almost instantly. Yes, doctor. Within seconds, the message spread through the department. Nurses emerged from nearby hallways. A medical assistant hurried to prepare equipment. The same resident, Emily Brooks, looked toward Walter with visible relief. Ethan walked back to Walter and offered a warm smile. Mr. Hayes, if you do not mind, I would like to personally escort you. Walter looked genuinely surprised. Doctor, that is very kind, but I am sure there are people here who need you much more than I do. Ethan shook his head gently. Today, you are exactly where I need to be. Walter slowly rose from the chair. Emily stepped forward with a wheelchair, but Walter smiled politely. I believe I can still manage a few more steps. Ethan did not argue. Instead, he walked beside him at exactly the same pace. Not ahead, not behind, beside him. As they crossed the waiting room, conversations grew quieter. The elderly woman who had shared her blanket smiled softly. The little boy with the stuffed dinosaur waved again, and Walter lifted his hand in return. Several employees watched in confusion. They had never seen the chief surgeon personally accompany a patient from the waiting room. Fewer still had ever seen him postpone everything else without a single complaint. No dramatic announcement had been made. No raised voices echoed through the lobby. Yet somehow everyone understood that something far more powerful than authority had just entered the room. It was respect. And for the first time that morning, Walter Hayes was no longer invisible. The examination room was quiet except for the soft hum of medical equipment and the gentle tapping of a keyboard as nurses completed Walter Hayes' long overdue assessment. His vital signs were carefully recorded. Blood samples were collected. A physician from internal medicine reviewed every detail without rushing a single question. Walter answered each one with patience, occasionally apologizing for taking up so much of everyone's time. Every apology made the room feel a little quieter. "You have absolutely nothing to apologize for," Emily Brooks said with a reassuring smile as she adjusted the blood pressure cuff. Walter smiled back. "That is very kind of you to say." Outside the room, Dr. Ethan Carter remained standing in the hallway with several department leaders gathered around him. No one spoke first. They all sensed this conversation was about something larger than scheduling or hospital policy. Ethan finally broke the silence. "Do you know why I asked all of you to come here?" A few uncertain glances passed between them. The charge nurse answered honestly. "No, doctor." Ethan looked through the small window in the examination room door. Walter was thanking a technician for offering him a glass of water. "That gentleman has spent his entire life putting other people before himself," Ethan said quietly. Today he waited more than 2 hours without a single complaint because he believed everyone else deserved to go first. No one answered. Ethan continued. "My father owed his life to that man. Because of one decision Mr. Hayes made decades ago, my father came home. He married my mother. He raised our family. Everything I have accomplished began with an act of courage performed by someone who never expected recognition." The hallway remained completely still. Even the busiest employees passing nearby instinctively lowered their voices. The receptionist who had checked Walter in earlier slowly looked toward the examination room. Her expression changed as she replayed every brief conversation she had shared with him that morning. She remembered his smile, his patience, the way he had thanked her every single time, even when she had barely looked at him. Shame settled quietly where indifference had once been. Ethan noticed the expression on her face and spoke gently. "This is not about one employee making one mistake. It is about all of us remembering that every person who walks through these doors carries a story we cannot see." Emily stepped out of the examination room, holding Walter's chart. "Dr. Carter, his evaluation is complete. The physician believes further imaging would be helpful, but thankfully everything appears stable so far." Ethan smiled with visible relief. "Good. Let us make sure he receives every test he needs today." As the team dispersed to prepare the next steps, several staff members quietly approached Walter one by one. The receptionist entered first. She stopped beside his chair, folding her hands together. "Mr. Hayes," she said softly, "I owe you an apology. I should have treated you with more care this morning." Walter looked genuinely surprised. "Please do not trouble yourself," he answered kindly. "Everyone has difficult days." His forgiveness arrived so naturally that it humbled everyone in the room. The charge nurse offered a warm blanket. Another employee brought fresh coffee. Emily found a new veteran service brochure and placed it beside his belongings, thinking he might enjoy seeing the support programs available. None of them acted because they feared Dr. Carter. They acted because, for the first time that day, they truly saw the man sitting quietly before them. And once they finally saw him, it became impossible to look away. By late afternoon, the rain outside had finally stopped. Soft sunlight filtered through the hospital windows, washing the hallways in a warm golden glow that felt entirely different from the gray morning Walter Hayes had walked into. His final test results were reassuring. The physicians explained that with medication, rest, and a follow-up visit, he was expected to recover well. Walter listened carefully, thanked every member of the medical team by name, and folded the printed instructions with the same care he had given every important document throughout his life. As he prepared to leave, Dr. Ethan Carter met him once more near the hospital entrance. For a moment, neither man spoke. Some conversations did not need many words. Ethan reached into the pocket of his white coat and removed the old photograph Walter had accidentally dropped earlier. It had already been safely returned, but Ethan carried something else with him now. He unfolded a newer photograph from his wallet. It showed his late father smiling beside his family many years before. "He would have wanted you to have this copy," Ethan said quietly. "He always kept your picture close. I think it is time both stories stayed together." Walter accepted the photograph with hands that trembled ever so slightly. His eyes rested on Daniel Carter's familiar smile before he looked back at Ethan. "Your father became exactly the man I hoped he would become," he said softly. "Looking at you today, I think he would be very proud." Ethan smiled, although emotion briefly filled his eyes. "Everything I learned about honoring people began with him. Everything he learned about courage began with you." Before Walter stepped outside, Several hospital employees gathered near the lobby. No ceremony had been planned. No speeches had been scheduled. They simply wanted the chance to shake his hand. The receptionist who had first checked him and thanked him for accepting her apology. Emily Brooks wished him safe travels and promised herself she would never again assume that a quiet patient needed the least attention. Even the security officer held the front door open with genuine respect. Walter greeted each person with the same humble smile. He never mentioned the hours he had waited. He never reminded anyone of the mistake. He simply wished them all a peaceful evening. As he reached the sidewalk, he paused beneath the American flag fluttering gently above the entrance. He adjusted his faded veteran cap, took one slow breath of the cool autumn air, and began walking toward the bus stop. His steps remained steady. His shoulders remained straight. Behind him, Ethan watched until the elderly man disappeared beyond the line of maple trees glowing with late-season color. The next morning, a framed photograph appeared in the hospital staff lounge. It showed a group of young soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder beneath an American flag, smiling with quiet confidence. Beneath it, a simple plaque carried only one sentence. Every patient has a story before they become a chart. Over time, new employees would stop to read those words before beginning their first shift. Most would never know the full story behind the photograph. They did not need to. They only needed to remember that dignity is never measured by wealth, appearance, or influence. Sometimes the strongest heroes arrive wearing worn jackets, carrying old photographs, and asking for nothing more than a little kindness. And sometimes the greatest act of respect is simply choosing to truly see the person standing in front of you.